got something in the world it was an odd, I didn't realize. I guess the warehouses are so humongous. They have everything.
Started with the microwave and baked potatoes. When we didn't have to wait an hour for baked potato anymore, that was the beginning of the downfall.
Microwave.
Control of the vertical and horizontal here. I think I do.
Oh, that's great.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get going. I've noticed as I've gone through and extracted the video of this from the long video that starts recording at 7:30 until this is over, and I have to go in and pull out the sermon, pull out the service, pull out the class, which is easy enough, but these really do go an hour.
Yeah.
And that's great. So we need to get started because this week I have to roll that back into the other room. So, so today it's about Christianity and various brands and how the Episcopal Church talks about Christianity. There's no videos today, but I thought because we're not doing a video or an audio clip, that we'd be consistent and follow the Prothero outline, just so that you could see how Christianity fits in with those others. And those of you who've been part of this discussion for the last 4 or 5 weeks, maybe I shouldn't have put anything down. I should have said, okay, what do you think the problem is? What do you think the solution is? What do you think the techniques are? And what do you think, who are the exemplars? That might have been a fun conversation, but I didn't think about it until 30 seconds ago.
Thank you for not doing that.
we might have flunked.
So anyway, Prothero identifies at least for Christianity, the problem is sin. The solution is salvation. Who'd have thought? And the techniques, he spends some time talking about this, is depending on which brand of Christianity you're in. It could be faith, or it could be works, or it could be some combination of both. And that was one of those big sort of arguments at the Reformation, of course, is the Reformers were faith only, and they probably characterized poorly medieval Catholicism to think that it was just works only, but it came out that way. And certain say, well, it's faith supplemented by works. If you're not showing something, then your faith is void. And there's good New Testament evidence. And who are the exemplars? They're the saints.
Could you explain the Prothero approach that we're using, because some of us may not recall fully?
Okay, so what Prothero does is he looks at each religion using the same 4-step approach. He thinks that each religion, he doesn't like the idea that all religions are the same. He articulates what he sees as the distinctive qualities of each religion. Each religion sees that there is a problem to be solved. So if the problem in Buddhism was suffering, that's a different problem than a problem being sin. And so there's a problem to be solved. Each religion has a solution that it proposes. And each religion has certain techniques that are used to help you achieve that solution. So going back to Buddhism, the solution is nirvana, getting out of this endless cycle of births and rebirths. And the techniques are following the Noble Eightfold Path. So in Christianity, the techniques are faith and or works. You do that, and then you achieve salvation. And who has done that before that we can hold up as examples? It's primarily the saints, although it may be your great-grandmother.
Why would it not be
Thanks for the recap.
being included in the Pentecost?
Well, that's a good question. And so if you couldn't hear, Elaine asked why Jesus isn't the exemplar. He draws the distinction when he's talking about Islam between Muhammad and Jesus, is that Muhammad was never declared divine. And so Jesus is, for Christians, Jesus is divine. And so he's kind of on a different level than this whole thing. He didn't have to do what we mere mortals do because he has this other part of his being that's divine. Okay, good.
Let me say two.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting that you would ask. There are a lot of people say, what would Jesus do is a really bad question, because if you ran out of water or if you ran out of wine, what would Jesus do? Jesus would turn water into wine. I don't have that. So asking me what would Jesus do is, so some people would say, the real question is, what would Jesus have you do? And there the saints have told us and all those kinds of things. Go ahead.
Just want to say, sin has gotten such a trivialized, I think, in our common understanding. If you sin, you've been a naughty boy or a naughty girl. I think this is a bigger category. This is separation from God. This is anything that separates us from God. And it's not all individual sin. It's corporate sin. It's what we do as a nation, what we do as a church, what we do as a family. And so don't allow the word sin to be the lowest common denominator of our bad habits. Sin is the big problem because we are, in some sense, separated from God, and we need to get back. So,
yeah.
We also need to remember that Christ wasn't a Christian.
Right.
That's right. That's right. So, getting into what we're talking about today, which is really how does the Episcopal Church talk to other Christian groups? I thought a way to talk about this was that from the very get-go, there was a concern about diversity, disunity, and unity. And I started this out with, in the New Testament, and shortly thereafter, there were plenty of Christianities, not just one. And we tend to think, and a lot of people say we want to get back to early Christianity as if there was such a thing. And, you don't have to think too far. You remember Jesus being quoted in John 10. He says, I have other sheep that are not of this flock. I mean, that's a hint right there that not everybody that's in this room are the only Christians. And you really see that spelled out in a lot of the rest of the New Testament as the New Testament writers are trying to address folks who understand Jesus and Christianity differently than the way that what came to be known as the Orthodox churches, orthodoxy understood it. So it's there very, very early on. But then after the New Testament, although it begins in the New Testament, we see it much more afterwards, is that the apostles and other folks went out on missionary journeys and they established churches where they landed. And so St. Mark is associated with Alexandria in Egypt. We talked, there's some folks in the room who are doing Episcopal 101, and for those of you who've done it in the past or haven't, remind you that the Christianity hit Britain before Roman Catholicism was Roman Catholicism. There was this Celtic Christianity in Britain, and there were some controversies once Rome got there over, how they should organize monasteries, what date Easter fell on, all sorts of things. So there was a Christianity there that they had to figure out how to do this. Rome was its own thing. And then you've got Thomas, by tradition, went into Syria and founded the Mar Thoma, the St. Thomas Church of Syria, which went on into India. And as time went on, these various centers founded by apostles or other disciples developed their own unique characteristics. And sometimes there were pretty significant theological differences between these various bodies. So the church that was centered in Alexandria had a very different theology than the church that was centered in Antioch, which had a very different theology than the church that was centered in Constantinople or Rome. We talk about the five, church historians, wonky people like me, talk about the five early patriarchates of Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome, as if there was one thing, but there wasn't. There were at least five and many more. And you began to see this spelled out as each church, each sort of local congregation or local body began to address some theological tendencies that were veering in one direction or another. And one of the places where we see that in our creed is in this phrase that in Latin is Filioque. We believe in the Holy Spirit who proceeds from the Father and the Son. And that phrase Filioque is "and the Son." And that was put into the creed in Spain to combat a heresy called Aryanism. And it got adopted in Rome because there were a lot of Arians in the western part of the empire. It was never as big a deal in the East, and the East never adopted it. So the Western churches and the Eastern churches still fight over the Filioque. And when, Bishop Epting will remember this, some of you may too, when we went through to revise the prayer book from the 28 prayer book to the 79 prayer book, there were some discussions as to whether we should have the Filioque in the Nicene Creed, as which we say that we say on Sunday mornings. And in one of the proposed liturgies, it was left out. And that created too much of an uprising. It's still not a universal creed. That Filioque is a creed of the Western Church. And I'm sure you'll get into that a little bit more. And then, of course, there were these problems between Rome and Constantinople. Where was the center of Roman sort of where was the chief or the first among equals of the patriarchs? And so depending on which scholar you talk to, Rome and Constantinople split. The sort of the majority view says that it split in 1054 when some folks didn't go to the right council and they didn't carry their names across. And other scholars say, well, there was never any excommunication. The Romans didn't excommunicate the Constantinopolitans and vice versa. So really it didn't split until 1453 when the Crusaders went through and sacked Constantinople. That's pretty significant, is when you've got the Roman Catholic side coming through and sacking Istanbul, Constantinople on their way to free Jerusalem. That was really where other scholars would say that final split was. But here you've got, for the last 700 years, this clearly or more, this split between East and West. And then, of course, 100 years after the fall of Constantinople, we've got Martin Luther hammering his theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg. And the church very visibly sort of split again between Catholic and Protestant, and then with Zwingli and Calvin Reformed, and then Anglicans, and it's the way that it split from continental Catholicism. So there have been over the centuries, there have been attempts to bring the churches back together, the various separated churches. And while there may have been some prior to the early 19th century, the one that I'm most familiar with because I became a member of this group, a body founded, if you want to call it, by a couple of guys, Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone, who in the wake of the Great Awakenings at the end of the 17th and into the end of the 18th and into the 19th century, were really dismayed by the fractioning or the fracturing of the churches, and really wanted to get back together, bring everybody back together. And so they, in two different parts of sort of the Middle Eastern part of the United States, independently started working on how do we bring churches back together. And then they found that they were really doing the same thing and kind of joined forces. And it became known as the Restoration Movement. And they wanted to restore the New Testament church, again, as if there were one. And they had this no book but the Bible, no creed but Christ. Where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible's silent, we're silent. Some other phrases that I've used or you've heard used in other contexts. And they worked together for a while, but even then they couldn't decide what would you do if the Bible was silent? So the Bible doesn't talk in the New Testament about instruments being used in worship. So you've got the Church of Christ, which doesn't use instruments in worship. They sing really well, but they do it without a piano or an organ or a guitar or anything else. And then you've got the Christian Church's Disciples of Christ, which are very much still engaged in kind of broader ecumenical movements. So even here's a group that wanted to restore unity that's fractured at least 3 times as it moved forward. Very difficult. And then at the end of the 19th century, the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion agreed on the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral. These were the 4 things that the Episcopalians and then the Anglican Communion decided were the center points of any communion, any unity going forward. The Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament as being the sufficient statement of our faith, the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion, the historic episcopate, which is, I'm sure you'll get to. What's the 4th one?
Creeds.
Creeds. Oh yeah, the Apostles' and Nicene Creeds as being. So that was kind of how the Episcopal Church said, this is how we'll move forward. And it still guides, as Bishop Epting will talk about. Well, after the World War II, there were more efforts to try and bring the churches together. And the World Council of Churches, I think you mentioned that last week. Now, a few years later, the National Council of Churches. These were not necessarily meant to create a super church, but to give a forum for the different churches to actually have conversations with one another on matters of common concern. Some took this a little farther. So in 1957, the United Church of Christ was formed. And that was a union between what was the old Evangelical United Brethren. Yeah, the Evangelical United Brethren, and what were then called the Congregational Churches. And now, and they have formed one church called the United Church of Christ. They glom together. Similarly, the United Methodists rejoined the Southern Methodists and the Northern Methodists. The Evangelical Lutheran Church grew out of the Lutheran Church of America, and the Evangelical, there were 2 Lutheran churches that rejoined, and then some have split off from there. Right. So there's this constant sort of trying to get back together and not working out so well for some folks. From the early 60s until the early 2000s, there was a strong movement called the Consultation on Christian Union. And this was primarily all of the mainline churches, including Episcopalians, trying to figure out how we could reform a sort of a united church. And it didn't work for a variety of reasons. You may be able to address some of that. It didn't work in the United States. It worked to some extent in Canada and in Australia, where the mainline Protestants, not the Episcopalians, not the Church of England, but the mainline Protestants in Canada became the United Church of Canada, as you see there at the bottom, down sort of bottom left center. And in Australia, it's the Uniting Church in Australia. So if you go to either of those countries, you're not going to find a Methodist church. You're not going to find a Presbyterian church. You're not going to find a congregational church. You'll find one of these uniting churches, but both in Britain or both in Australia and in Canada, you'll go and you'll find the Church of England as its own separate body. So that's kind of the background for where we are today. What we've seen is churches splitting in the last 15, 20, 25, 30 years over issues of sexuality. Not so much doctrine in the way that they were splitting before over salvation by faith alone as opposed to works. And so churches have been splitting primarily over and ordination of women, which is not the same, but sort of similar. Body gender issues have been where most of the churches have had problems. staying together since then. So that's kind of the background, and I'll let Bishop Epting take it in, and we'll probably have a lot of time for discussion.
Have a lot of time for discussion. We figured there'd be lots of experiences and other things to be shared. Let me talk about COCU, the Consultation on Church Union, first, real briefly, just because I'll forget to get to it if I don't. While I was in seminary, it had sort of hit its peak. We were really close at that point in the late 60s, early 70s. And I was so excited about it that they had basically agreed to the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral, those four basic things. And it looked like to me we could pull together, I won't get them all, but the churches that were involved were the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Disciples of Christ, Presbyterian Church USA, three black churches, the African Methodist Episcopal, the Christian Methodist Episcopal, and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And there are a couple more, not the Lutherans, strangely, that they weren't involved in it for reasons that they didn't want to do bilateral conversations. They always thought these multilateral conversations were a fool's errand. But we were very close, and it just foundered on all kinds of things. Some of it was race, quite frankly. How do we pull together these white and black churches with the different styles? Now, the Black Methodist churches they're quite liturgical in some ways, both charismatic and liturgical. They're wonderful churches, but they have troubles even working with the United Methodist Church. And so there were all those kinds of things. Presbyterians were always hell on bishops. They just didn't want to have bishops. And so that was a problem. And so there were all these issues, some theological and some more cultural, I think, and trying to pull together 9 churches. I mean, let's face it, that is quite a challenge with the different polities and pension funds.
I was going to say pension funds.
And all the rest of it. It still exists. It's now called the Churches of Christ Uniting or something like that, but it's pretty weak, and it's a kind of cooperative effort more than any sense of moving into real church union. But Gary gave a really good overview of how things kind of came apart. Almost from the Reformation times on, there were sporadic and informal attempts to get back together again. In England, for example, the more high church or Catholic-minded Anglicans wanted to get back together with Rome. They felt like it was a tragedy that we divided from Rome, and they figured it was more a political thing than a theological thing. It was Henry VIII and his, multiple marriages and all of that. But the more evangelical Anglicans, who had been influenced by the Continental Reformation, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, they had theological problems with Rome for sure. They didn't think it was political at all. They had problems with indulgences. They had problems with the papacy. They had problems with Marian devotion on a high level. And so the Church of England could never quite get its act together to come back to one with Rome. But there were certainly movements in that direction. There were formal dialogues really beginning in 1915 called the Malines Conversations, and they were actually official, and they went on for about 10 years between Church of England and Rome, but again, finally just kind of died a natural death. And it really wasn't until the 1960s, after the Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, that things really began to open up for serious conversation. Pope John the 23rd, sainted man that he was, not only led them into Vatican II, but he established something called the Secretariat for Christian Union, which was the first formal group within the Vatican to really work hard at church union again. He invited finally Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, to the Vatican in 1960. And that was a huge step. That had not been done before. And then in 1966, Pope Paul VI famously gave another Archbishop of Canterbury his Episcopal ring. The Episcopal ring that he had worn as Archbishop of Milan. He gave it to the Archbishop of Canterbury. I mean, that was a significant symbolic gesture. He also said that Anglicans were a sister church. That was a huge step. Even to call us a church was a huge step in those days.
Separated brethren.
Separated brethren, right? Those who have fallen far short. Well, things moved really quickly from that point on. The Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission was started in 1967. ARCIC, it's called by its acronym. And shortly after that, the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue in the USA started, ARC-USA. And that was when the Episcopal Church and the Roman Catholic Church began serious face-to-face regular dialogues, which continues on today. I was part of those in the early 2000s. I was the staff person to that conversation. It was just a wonderful experience. We learned so much from each other. We celebrated the Eucharist every morning under the, Rome will not allow us to receive communion. And so we honored that discipline. We celebrated an Episcopal communion, and their bishops and priests and lay people would come forward and cross their hands for a blessing. On the alternate morning, they would celebrate the Roman Mass, and we would go forward and cross our hands and receive a blessing. When I first started with that, I thought, this is hypocrisy. We just shouldn't celebrate the Eucharist if we can't do it together. And yet we learn so much from each other, how similar the Eucharistic liturgies are, and that we basically believe the same things about the sacrament. And so it was worth doing, I think. We used our Book of Common Prayer for the daily offices one day and the Roman Breviary for the daily office the next day. So there was this worship component as well as theological conversations. There have been some amazing breakthroughs that have taken place both on the international level and also here in the United States. I'll just file these by title. There was an agreed statement on the Eucharist in 1971 that we basically believed the same thing about the Eucharist. The whole idea of transubstantiation, which was a big kind of theological Thomas Aquinas concept, was relegated to a footnote in this book. The Romans don't go to the grave fighting about transubstantiation anymore. The idea that we really receive the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist is a common thing that we hold together. And that book is very much clear about that. There was an agreed statement on the local and universal church, how the local diocese and the international instruments like the Anglican Communion and the papacy function. There was a statement on the gift of authority in 2003 that dealt with the Pope. And the Anglicans said in that we could envision the possibility of accepting a universal primate at some point, but we had a lot of work to do before we could get there, that we weren't quite prepared to accept the papacy as it currently exists. But in concept, would we be opposed to a universal pastor who was a kind of guiding light for the church universal? And no, we would not be opposed to that. And so that's a huge step. Again, the details to be worked out. There was a statement a book called Mary, Grace and Hope in Christ, which again brought us together. It's very close in our understandings of Mary. Clearly the Roman Church has ways of venerating her that we find difficult, but the idea that we could ask Mary to pray for us in heaven like we could ask our relatives to pray for us in heaven is a concept that Anglicans can embrace. We don't expect the saints to do things for us, but we believe that it's possible to ask them to pray for, join their prayers with ours. So we reached substantial agreement in a lot of these areas, but not total agreement. The dialogues continue. The dialogues continue to this very month. Close to Rome, really, in some ways. The Eastern Orthodox churches, there is an ES on the end of that, really were slow getting into the ecumenical movement because, as Gary said, they officially claim to be the only Orthodox Christians around. So why would we talk to anybody else? We are the Orthodox Church. And they were somewhat insular national churches that were sort of turned inward in some ways. They had not reached out in some of the ways that Western Christians have. And yet, Anglicans and the Orthodox have so much in common. Neither one of us has a pope. We have a different kind of leadership. We're each national autonomous churches. The Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Ukrainian Orthodox. We can talk about that. So we're really held together more by bonds of affection, it's called, by our sort of similarities and our love for one another and our joint mission as Anglicans than we are by a pope or even by a creed. And the Orthodox really are the same way. The Archbishop of Canterbury, as you probably know, doesn't have any real power or authority over individual Anglican churches. He provides leadership, guidance, a kind of focus of unity. But the Archbishop of Constantinople, Bartholomew, has a similar role for the Orthodox. He, just to bring it to current events, when Ukraine separated after the fall of the Soviet Union, Bartholomew recognized the Orthodox Church in Ukraine as a separate province of Orthodoxy. And that made the Russian Orthodox Church furious. They were just not happy with that at all, and still aren't. And so you have this kind of rivalry between the Russian Orthodox Church and Ukraine. And of course, you have the Greeks and you have the Syrians, you have all kinds of different Orthodox expressions. But we have so much in common with the Orthodox theologically. We have so much in common with them in spirituality. How many of us have learned to use the Jesus prayer, and how many of us have learned something about the desert fathers and mothers that came out of that tradition, or started that tradition in many ways. The centrality of worship, such an important part of Orthodoxy. Icons. Episcopal Church never had icons in it before we got serious about our conversation with the Orthodox and understanding what icons mean in their worship. Not only that we're looking at God through the icon, but God's looking at us through the icon. Very, very powerful. So we had several statements with them, with the Orthodox. The Moscow statement in 1976 said that we agreed the same thing about the inspiration and authority of Scripture. The Dublin agreed statement in 1984 was on the mystery of the church and worship and tradition, how important tradition is. Of course, for the Orthodox, tradition is almost more important than Scripture. It is huge. For us, less so. We talk about the three-legged stool for Anglicans: Scripture, tradition, and reason. But nonetheless, we stare a reverence for the tradition. We don't just throw it out because it might be difficult. And finally, there's been a Cyprus statement. I'm not sure when the Cyprus statement came out, but it's in the last 10 years anyway. It's on the Church of the Triune God, the Trinity, and our understanding of the Trinity. Again, substantial agreements in all of these critical areas. So we were well on our way, really, in the 60s and early 70s to a kind of full visible unity that the World Council of Churches has always said is the goal. Let's get back together again, even though it was never all completely one. But let's visibly come back together again, institutionally even come back together again. And then the Episcopal Church and then the rest of the Anglican Communion took the historic step of ordaining women to the priesthood in 1976 for us. And in 1989, we ordained our first bishop, consecrated our first woman bishop, Barbara Harris. And then the Church of England did the same thing in 1994. They took the step into the ordination of women. They didn't wait as long between ordaining women priests and ordaining women bishops as we did. It took us a long time. We had priests long before we had Barbara Harris as our first woman bishop. And so obviously that placed a huge obstacle, if you will, in the way of these dialogues, because neither Rome nor any expression of orthodoxy has yet made the step to recognize that women can be ordained priests. And so we took a big risk, and we sacrificed something because of justice. We sacrificed something because we felt God called us to this step. And so it closed some doors, or at least it made them a little bit more tight to get through, to get to the unity on the Catholic side, if you will. But it opened doors for us on the Protestant side of our ecumenical relations. Anglicans have always believed that we're a kind of bridge church, that because of providence or historical accident, we stand in the middle of Catholicism and Protestantism, that we hold hands on both sides. We understand the Catholic tradition. We understand the Protestant truth and that which has challenged Catholicism. And so at our best, we can understand both sides and pull both sides together again. So this opened doors to us on the Protestant side. And it led to us coming into full communion relationships with various churches. If we could put that definition up, I just want to spend a minute on that. As we began to recognize various churches, where's my full communion definition? Thank you. This was actually written down for the first time in our dialogue with the Lutherans, which led us into full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. But it's been a principle that we've worked with ecumenical relations for a long, long time. It says we understand full communion between churches to be a relation between distinct churches in which each recognizes the other as a Catholic and Apostolic church holding the essentials of the Christian faith. Within this new relation, churches become interdependent while remaining autonomous. Diversity is preserved, but that diversity is not static. Neither church seeks to remake the other in its own image, but each is open to the gifts of the other as it seeks to be faithful to Christ and his mission. They are together committed to a visible unity in the church's mission to proclaim the word and administer the sacraments. So full communion is not a merger. It is not coming together institutionally, but it is a full recognition of the validity of the other church as church, that we share substantially the same beliefs, that whatever we differ is not enough to keep us separate at the table at communion, that we can indeed share clergy across denominational lines, because we have come into this step. It doesn't happen quickly. It takes years and even decades of dialogue and prayer and work to get to that particular place. And so using that particular definition as a way to move forward, we have come into full communion with the following churches. And I'm just going to, again, file them by title because I want to leave some time for discussion. I'll say a couple things about each one because there are things that you're not probably very familiar with. We first came into full communion with the old Catholic churches of the Union of Utrecht. This is a group of churches in the Netherlands and Switzerland and throughout Europe. And for a while, there was a branch here in the United States. They broke with the Roman Catholic Church after Vatican I back in 1869. Vatican I sort of hardened some theological positions of the Roman Church about the Pope's role and other things that these group of Catholics said, this is not how we understand the Catholic Church to be. This is an innovation, the way you define these things. So we're going to be the old Catholics. We're going to maintain almost like a restorationist movement. Mm-hmm. We're going to retain the original Catholicism. And so they broke away and became what we now know as the old Catholic churches. They're in union with Utrecht. And in 1935, with the Archbishop of Utrecht. In 1934, we declared ourselves in full communion with this church. It means we could exchange, we could receive the sacrament at each other's altars, we could exchange clergy, we could do a variety of things, have their bishops jointly present at ordinations, at consecrations of our bishops. So you sort of bring the lines together at that point. So it was an important step. The next one in 1961 was something called the Ecclesia Filipina Independiente, or the Philippine Independent Church. This is a great church. Nobody knows about it, but it's a great church. There are more of them in the Philippines than there are of us here. They broke away from the Roman Catholic Church in 1902 because they wearied of the Roman Catholic Church's complicity with every occupying power from Spain to the United States. And they wanted to be an independent Catholic Church in the Philippines, which was not kowtowing to Rome. We're not a Roman Catholic Church, we're a Philippine Catholic Church, a national church, if you will. And so we've come into communion with them. They're mainly working class people, blue collar folks. I call them the labor movement at prayer. They're just unbelievably wonderful church. And they protest the terrible government that the Philippines has had on and on and on. And yet they're fiercely loyal to the Philippines as their culture. Gary mentioned the Martoma Syrian Church of Malabar, India. That was another church that we came into full communion with, a very interesting church. They claim that to be founded by St. Thomas, who the tradition has it, went to I think Syria first and then India, but who basically they look to as their founder, regardless of the exact historicity. Nonetheless, they're an ancient church, an Orthodox church. And yet, in the 19th century, they were heavily influenced by evangelical Anglican missionaries to India. And so they began to do some kind of reforming of their own. And so here is an Orthodox church that celebrates the Syrian liturgy, and they sing gospel hymns. It's just unbelievable. It's so wonderful. I was privileged to celebrate that Eucharist with them. It's in English, but it's a Syrian Orthodox liturgy in Chicago when I was assisting bishop there. And it's very rich and very full and very clearly Orthodox, and yet here you sing Amazing Grace or something like that. So they're not recognized by some of the other Eastern Orthodox churches as true Orthodox, but they are nonetheless a little church that's in communion with us. They're very active in the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches. They show up. They have these wonderful sort of vestments that are pink or saffron, or just wonderful church. A huge breakthrough took place in 2000 when we came into fellowship or full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. And I could go on forever with that because I was part of that dialogue, but I'm going to stop. They have 5 million people. We have less than 2 million in this country. And so coming into full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America was a huge step. It took us a while to get there, but we made it in 2000. I was in Iowa, where I used to say there are more Lutherans than Christians. And so I worked with the Lutherans a lot. Lutheran pastors served some of our little churches. Episcopal priests served some of the Lutheran churches, and it was a very, very rich relationship. The last couple would be the Moravian Church of northern and southern provinces of the Moravian Church. We came into communion with them in 2010. This goes back to John Huss in Bohemia back in the 15th century. Who really was an early reformer. He wanted to do the same things that we later did through Luther and Calvin and all the rest. Mass in English, married clergy, variety of things that ended up being Reformation principles, but he was a bit early for his time, so he really suffered. He founded something called the Unitas Fratrum, or the Unity of the Brethren, and that became the Moravian Church. They're small, but they have done amazing missionary work in Africa and in the Caribbean. They've given up their lives. Some of them sold themselves into slavery so that they could minister to slaves in Haiti and in the Caribbean. So a great church. Finally, the Church of Sweden. We had always known that they had apostolic succession, that they'd kept the historic episcopate, that their bishops ordained their priests, they called them priests, yet they're a Lutheran church. And so we had just never formalized it. So now that we had this full communion relationship and ability to sort of articulate what we were doing, we did a General Convention passed full communion with them in 2015, and they did the same thing. The last thing I'll say is, and then we'll open it up, is that we still struggle with our dialogues with the United Methodists and the Presbyterians, which is very strange. In some ways, they're the closest to us. The United Methodists, as you know, Methodism came out of Anglicanism. John and Charles Wesley were always very proud to say they died Anglican priests, but they'd had a renewal movement within the Church of England called Methodism, follow this method of prayer and fasting and Eucharist and all of that. And so we do have a problem with them in some ways. If you look at a Methodist hymnal and their liturgy in the Methodist hymnal, it's very much the Episcopal Church's liturgy or the Anglican Communion Church's liturgy. The two problems we have, one is a big problem, one is not very big, I think. The big problem is their understanding of bishops. They have a strong episcopate. They have bishops in this country. They don't have bishops, however, in England, but in this country they do. And so when we tell them, well, we need you to kind of come into apostolic succession, we need you to sort of be ordained by some of our bishops as well, they say, why? We are bishops. We don't need to have your particular brand of episcopacy. And so we haven't been able to break that logjam. The proposal was to have us all come together, have bishops lay hands on each other and sort of exchange the lines, sort of bring the lines in without saying that one is superior to the other or one is more historic than the other, but simply share the gifts of both episcopates in a big national service of some kind, but that hasn't happened yet. Presbyterian Church, as I laughed about earlier, are just death on bishops. Their whole concept is they're presbyters. The elders are the ones who are the leaders of the church, not bishops. They would see the threefold ministry as taking place in a local congregation. The ordained presbyter would be the bishop of that congregation. The board of elders, if you will, would be the presbyterate, and there'd be a board of deacons. So they say in each congregation, we have a threefold ministry. So why do we need to do it with you? In some ways, we're the closest to these two churches, and yet there are these theological perhaps gnats that we strain at that have kept us from coming into what I believe would be a very rich relationship. The Methodists are huge, as you know. They form churches on every corner in every missionary district they've ever been part of. So I want to stop with that, and let's just open it up to see what questions you have. You probably have experiences in different churches yourselves. Maybe something we can do to lift that up. Go.
If you see, we get together for a quarterly Altrea with the Roman Catholics.
Yep.
And I remember sitting at a table, they mixed us up, and I was sitting at a table with a Catholic gal that had just retired, and she was so excited because she could go to this service, this prayer thing every morning. And I said, oh, I've never heard of that. Tell me what it's like. Well, dang, if it isn't morning prayer with different words.
Yeah,
I said,
exactly.
we had that service and put down a prayer book, flipped it open. I thought rivals were going to fall.
Yeah.
Because she had no idea that we were real Christians and could pray. And then the other thing we used to do in our general area, we would get together. I'm thinking quarterly, but I might be fuzzing with the details. But we get together and have a community service with the Anglicans, the United Church, and the
Lutherans.
Lutherans, I think, yeah. And it was the most interesting Eucharist because it took a long time, because there was a common cup with wine, a common cup with grape juice,
Yeah.
itty little cups with wine, itty little cups with grape juice, bread, wafers, I don't know, that's before gluten-free, so there wasn't that. And it was like, it was so much fun because everybody was going, you know, in every direction to get to the right vessel.
Yep.
For this, but it was very cool.
That's wonderful. Both those things are wonderful. The I fail to say what the small issue was with Methodism. It's wine or grape juice. You know, they've at least in this country have made a strong statement about alcohol and not wanting to receive alcohol. That they're, you know, they're a little less strict about that today than they used to be, but nonetheless, that's part of their tradition. And so they weren't going to be offering alcohol in church at the altar rail. And so how do we do that? Our Lambeth Quadrilateral says Holy Communion with the elements ordained by Christ himself. We're pretty sure he didn't use Welch's. And so we use wine. However, I have been in Episcopal churches who were very sensitive to alcoholics and people who have difficulty with alcohol that did offer grape juice as an option in one chalice. So that's what we do with the United Methodists. I've celebrated many joint Eucharists with the United Methodists where we have a chalice of grape juice and a chalice of wine, and people go to which one that they wish to receive. So I think that's a minor issue, but initially it was quite a big issue.
I just want to jump in. So you all know that, and I think most of you know that I did my PhD at Duke, and Duke was founded by Methodists, and the Duke Divinity School is still a Methodist divinity school, and so the graduate student lounge was actually located in divinity school property. And there were always concerns about whether or not the graduate students, who had nothing to do with the divinity school, were drinking alcoholic beverages in the graduate student lounge, which
mercy.
Yeah, and then the other thing just about that is that the divinity school chapel, which had been relocated, which had taken over what used to be the library, big sign outside, no food and drink allowed. And I was thinking about this as, you know, is this heavenly food and drink? You know, what wasn't allowed? Because, you know, they would certainly be doing communion in there, and that's not. Anyway, sorry about that. That was, but it was interesting to see how that spelled its way out in some of these other ways. But that concern about we can't have that party in that room.
Let me mention Cursillo while you mentioned. I'm a great supporter and believer in Cursillo movement. I was the national bishop to serve on their national board for a while. Cursillo was a great ecumenical movement. Roman Catholics sort of bequeathed it to the Episcopal Church first, and then later to the Methodists and others, and their expressions of this 4-day renewal weekend and a follow-up program called the Fourth Day, where you meet with a small group and meet together for ultreas. That's the kind of wonderful, rich sharing that is now taking place ecumenically, which never could. We have to remember back to our youth, some of us, when you didn't even want to go into a Roman Catholic church, and they certainly wouldn't come into a Protestant church. Those days are gone, and we are cross-fertilizing each other with all kinds of richness, which I think is going to lead to unity of some kind eventually, if Jesus doesn't come back first. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid of Presbyterian. And when I was in high school, in our Sunday school group, we would argue with our teacher that Jesus served wine. What's the problem, people?
Good for you. Stand up for the truth. I say.
I also have she's still alive. I have dear friends who went to Holy Family, which was in North Denver, and I went to Lutheran. So when we went to college and met, we were close friends. I remember going Good Friday and doing the Stations of the Cross with her in Greeley. Yeah, I don't need the icons. You know, it's not that I find it wrong or bad. I don't need them.
Right.
And that was interesting for me. Elaine and Tom were here for my husband's funeral, and we had the Eucharist. And Elaine asked Bishop Weatherford if they could have communion, and he said yes.
Yes.
And they did. And I consider them more to the Episcopal side than the Roman Catholic side.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's one of the good things. My husband was baptized and confirmed Roman Catholic, and he was he was comfortable at Monte Boulevard Presbyterian Church, but he was also extremely comfortable here. And it's good for him.
Yeah.
With what we had here.
It's part of being the bridge.
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, so it sounds like the conversation is going towards, and listening to you about the communion of churches, of how we kind of need to get over ourselves. Sometimes there's, to an outsider, it would be such a trivial thing. What can you? And I just might add a story about the Eucharist that I saw in Mission Joy. This was that video interview between Desmond Tutu and Dalai Lama, and it was offered for free until Tuesday. What a great movie. So if you have an opportunity, you see that. But, so Desmond Tutu invited Dalai Lama in Dalai Lama's private meditation room, which was always off limits to anybody outside. So the Dalai Lama invited him inside, which was a huge historical event. And then inside that sacred space for Buddhists, Desmond Tutu performed the Eucharist. And meanwhile, the right-hand guy of the Dalai Lama was explaining to the audience that the Dalai Lama does not drink wine. He's never drank wine his entire life. And I'm sitting there wondering, well, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
And so the Dalai Lama takes his pinky, dips it into the wine, and drinks it. I'm going, this guy. So he crossed outside of his own bounds, and so Desmond Tutu, you know, doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that was a good role model, maybe in the future, as you said, how churches could be more.
It's absolutely right. Getting over ourselves is a big part of ecumenical relations. You know, I think the Chicago-Lambeth quadrilateral, properly understood, is a very basic and a doable way to move forward. The scriptures, clearly, we're going to all have to embrace the scriptures as having some kind of authority. The creeds as a summary of scriptural faith. The two sacraments that are pretty clearly go back to the earliest days of the church, baptism and the Eucharist. And then this bishop thing is a problem. But if you read the Lambeth Quadrilateral, it says the historic episcopate locally adapted in its means of administration. I think that gives us huge way forward. I argued always that the United Methodists had simply locally adapted the episcopate because the Church of England was so stuffy, it wouldn't allow John and Charles Wesley to preach the gospel. And so I think we could recognize Methodist bishops as in that spirit of historic succession that had been locally adapted. They clearly understand themselves as bishops. Now they ordain their own elders or presbyters. They ordain deacons now, a separate order of deacons in the Methodist Church. And so, I think we can get there, but we have to swallow our pride a little bit. We have to recognize that not all things are necessary, and that we can be in full communion with a church that does something that we don't quite agree with, as long as it doesn't get in the way of those basic things. In other words, icons don't do the same thing for me as they do for the Orthodox either, but I love their veneration of them and the way they use them and the beauty of them. I don't acknowledge the Pope's infallibility, even if it is very carefully defined as to how it's exercised, and yet I honor and reverence the historicity of the Bishop of Rome. I listen to what he says all the time. I take him very seriously. I see him as a kind of first among equals in some ways. And so we can get there, but we just need to swallow our pride sometimes. Yeah.
The great thing is that the churches, particularly in the United States, are very democratic. And I think that's something that, yes, England had that, but not like it did here. Not like you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you want to work at it. I would venture to say there are more different denominations in the United States than anywhere else in the world. Just like there are more breeds of horses in the United States than there is anywhere else in the world.
That's right.
And I learned that on PBS Wednesday night. My God, and it's that, I think that idea of individual thought, individual freedom. And I, as a Presbyterian, well, there's the synod,
Right.
and they meet, and we were part of the Presbyterian USA, and so the synod told us what we were going to do.
Right.
And that was, so I don't have any problem.
I want to just jump in here because we're going to have to stop in about 2 or 3 minutes because I got to take the projector into the other room. But I usually we hear some questions from folks who are joining us remotely. So I just want to make sure that if there are some remote folks who want to jump in, that they get an opportunity, because we can see who's raising their hands in this room, but we can't necessarily see so much on the Zoom screen. So
This is Whit. The thing about this series that's been very enriching for me is to show that you and the bishop have shown that, for example, all Christians don't worship the same way or aren't, I hate to use the term created equal, but there's such differences in the Christian faith and in the other faiths you've talked about. In other words, you can't lump all Muslims into one basket. And that's been very meaningful and enriching. I appreciate the two of you presenting this series. It's been wonderful.
It's been great fun.
yeah, it has been. Thanks, Whit, for bringing that up, because one of the things that occurred to me after your question last week about, where were the Muslims standing up against 9/11, is that none of the Muslim bodies have anything equivalent to the Pope or anything like that. So the question was always, who would be doing the speaking? And you might get it from a local imam, but they're not making front page news on the New York Times. So there were a lot of folks who were speaking out, but they just didn't have that centralized authority that a lot of Christians are accustomed to. We're expecting Bishop Curry to say something, or we're expecting the Pope to say something, but we don't. The Muslims don't have that central authority that we see in quite the same way. So yeah, that diversity and then who speaks is really critical. So thanks.